It was the evening of October 23rd, 2019, in Auburn, Alabama. Aniah Blanchard, 19 years old, had spent the day with her family. She and her brother Elijah had driven to northern Alabama that morning with their mother, Angela, to attend the funeral of a family friend. After the service, with a 4-hour drive back to Auburn ahead of them, Angela had watched her daughter hug her goodbye. "Hey, Mom, we really need to leave now because it's getting late," Aniah had told her. It was around 7 o'clock. Angela kissed her on the cheek and told her she loved her. On the way back to Auburn, the siblings stopped in Birmingham to see their stepfather, Walt, at home. He was training for his next fight. Aniah spent a little time with him, and then she and Elijah got back in the car and made the rest of the drive to Auburn. They arrived late. Aniah dropped her brother off at his place. The two lived about 10 minutes apart, both attending Southern Union State Community College in Auburn. She said goodnight. She headed home. At 11 p.m., her roommate, Sarah O'Brien, sent her a text message. "Are you almost home?" Aniah replied, "Yeah." She was minutes away. She never arrived. 30 minutes passed, then an hour. Sarah texted again. No response. She called, no answer. Something was wrong. Aniah was not someone who went silent. If Aniah wasn't home, something had happened. She was not someone who left her dog, Blue, alone overnight. She loved that dog like a baby, and everyone who knew her knew it. Sarah reached out to Elijah. Elijah called her mother, Angela. Angela and Walt got in the car and drove to Auburn immediately. By the morning of October 24th, a missing person report had been filed with the Auburn Police Department. Aniah Blanchard had vanished. She had texted, "Yeah, minutes from home," and then nothing, just silence where a young woman's life had been. Aniah Blanchard had grown up in Alabama, the daughter of Angela Harris and Elijah Blanchard Sr. She shared a birthday with her mother, both born on June 22nd, a detail Angela treasured. She described her daughter as a very happy girl who loved life, who always put other people before herself, who walked into a room and made people feel better simply by being there. She was 5 feet 6 inches tall with brown eyes and brown hair. She had a warmth that drew people in. Her stepfather, Walt Harris, a UFC heavyweight fighter, ranked 9th in the world in the fall of 2019, said she could walk in and pick you up no matter how down you were. He didn't call her his stepdaughter. He called her his child. That's just the way he saw it. Aniah and her brother Elijah were close. He called her every morning, and that was their routine, every single morning. She had also, for a long time, carried a deep-seated fear. People who knew her said Aniah had always been afraid of being kidnapped and harmed. It wasn't an abstract worry. It was something she talked about, something that lived with her. She had a specific fear of the thing that would ultimately happen to her. She was 19 years old and studying at Southern Union State Community College in Auburn. She was working. She was building a life. She had a roommate, a dog, a brother 10 minutes away, and a family that loved her with everything they had. And then the night of October 23rd, 2019, she sent one final text message and disappeared. On October 28, 2019, 5 days after Aniah went missing, the Auburn Police Department released a snippet of surveillance footage from a Chevron convenience store on South College Street in Auburn. The footage showed Aniah inside the store, making a purchase. It was time-stamped from the night of October 23rd. That purchase, that brief stop at a gas station on her way home, was the last confirmed sighting of Aniah alive. But she was not alone in that footage. Also visible in the surveillance video, at the same time Aniah was in the store, was a man. He was wearing a camouflage-colored jacket with Vans written across the back. He was driving a late 2000s model Lincoln Town Car, silver or gray. Investigators identified him. His name was Ibrahim Yazid. And there was more than just the video. A witness who had been at the gas station that night came forward with something that cameras had not captured. That witness told investigators they had seen Yazid force Aniah into her vehicle outside the store and then drive away with her. Yazid had not just been at the same gas station at the same time. He had abducted her from the parking lot. She had stopped for gas, an ordinary thing to do on a late drive home, and he had been watching. Investigators immediately began working to find Yazid. They also noted something that would later become central to the public conversation around this case. At the time he abducted Aniah Blanchard, Ibrahim Yazid was out on bond. Not for a minor offense. He was facing charges of kidnapping, attempted murder, and robbery. Charges connected to an incident in Montgomery in early 2019, in which 4 men had robbed and beaten 2 victims at a hotel. One of those victims, a 77-year-old man, had been left unconscious, unresponsive, severely injured, and near death. Yazid's criminal history went back further still. In 2012, he had been accused of attempting to kill 2 police officers by ramming his car into theirs. In 2017, he had been arrested for aggravated battery on a police officer. In June 2020, he would be additionally charged with the 2018 murder of a man named Stephen Hamby, as well as the attempted murder of a woman who was shot in the face during that same incident. He was a man with a long and violent history, and in October 2019, a judge had determined he was safe to release on bond while he awaited trial for kidnapping and attempted murder. Aniah Blanchard paid for that decision. 2 days after Aniah disappeared, on October 25, 2019, investigators located her vehicle. Her black 2017 Honda CR-V was found at an apartment complex in Montgomery, Alabama, approximately 55 miles from Auburn. It was scraped, it was dented, the damage to the exterior told investigators the vehicle had been in some kind of collision or altercation since it was last seen on surveillance leaving the gas station. Inside the vehicle, what investigators found confirmed their worst fears. Court documents would later describe blood evidence in the passenger compartment that was indicative of someone suffering a life-threatening injury. A fired shell casing was recovered from inside the vehicle. Possible blood pools in the carpet, traces of what appeared to be a cleaning agent, suggesting someone had attempted to remove evidence from the interior. DNA testing confirmed the blood was Aniah's. A bullet had been fired inside that car. Aniah had been shot while in her own vehicle, and then someone had attempted, imperfectly and hastily, to clean it up. Angela Harris would later say that when she learned about the car, she understood. The blood-soaked seat, the bullet in the door, Aniah's worst fear had become real. Her daughter had been taken, and whoever had taken her had not been gentle. She had been afraid of being kidnapped her whole life, and it happened. It happened in a gas station parking lot, minutes from home, on an ordinary October night. The Auburn Police Department, working jointly with the Montgomery Police Department and the FBI, launched an intensive investigation. Yazid was identified publicly as a suspect. An arrest warrant was issued, and then investigators learned he had left Alabama entirely. On November 7, 2019, authorities issued a first-degree kidnapping warrant for Ibrahim Yazid. By that point, he had already fled the state. On November 8, 2019, Yazid was located and arrested in Escambia County in western Florida. He was taken into custody at 2:32 in the morning. He was extradited back to Alabama and held in the Lee County Detention Center. He was denied bond. Back in Alabama, the search for Aniah continued. For more than a month, her family, law enforcement, and the community searched. Walt Harris, despite being in the middle of training camp for one of the biggest fights of his career, pulled out of his scheduled bout to focus on finding his stepdaughter. He and Angela drove through neighborhoods, yards, anywhere they could think to look. They went on television and social media pleading for information. The community responded. Search parties formed. Vigils were held. The case captured national attention, in part because of Walt's prominence as a UFC fighter, and in part because of who Aniah was, a 19-year-old student, a girl who always put others first, a daughter and a sister and a friend. Investigators were also working a specific lead. A man named Antoine Fisher, known by the nickname Squirmy, had information. Fisher's family members testified at trial that Yazid had appeared at a West Montgomery home in the early morning hours after Aniah disappeared. Fisher would eventually lead investigators to the location where Aniah's remains had been taken. On November 25, 2019, 33 days after Aniah went missing, human remains were discovered at a wooded area behind a church on County Road 2, near the town of Shorter in Macon County. 2 days later, on November 27th, investigators confirmed what her family had feared. The remains were Aniah Blanchard. The recovery of Aniah's remains was a painstaking process. Dr. Edward Reedy, the chief medical examiner for the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences, testified at trial that he had supervised the recovery operation personally. He described what they found as scattered, skeletonized remains that were incomplete and fragmented, the result of significant scavenging by animals, including feral dogs, over the weeks her body had been in that remote location. He testified that he made a positive identification of Aniah at the scene using dental x-rays. He concluded that the manner of death was homicide. The cause was a gunshot wound to the head. A projectile was recovered from the dirt near her remains, suggesting the bullet had passed through the victim while she was on the ground. The location of the remains behind a church in rural Macon County was far from Auburn, far from the gas station, far from the Montgomery apartment complex where her car had been found. Someone had driven a significant distance to leave her there, in a place unlikely to be easily discovered. Investigators had no direct evidence of exactly where the shot was fired. What they knew was that a bullet had been fired inside Aniah's car. What they knew was that a projectile was found near her remains. What they knew was that she had been alive when she left the gas station and dead when her body was found in Macon County. Everything in between was a chain of circumstantial and physical evidence pointing to one man. 33 days, her family searched for 33 days, and she had been there in those woods behind the church the whole time. Ibrahim Yazid was 30 years old at the time of Aniah's murder in 2019. By the time of his trial in 2026, he was 36. His criminal record was extensive and violent. The 2019 kidnapping and attempted murder charges that had him out on bond when he abducted Aniah were themselves the product of a January 2019 incident in which 4 men robbed and beat 2 victims at a Montgomery hotel. One of those victims, a 77-year-old man, beaten so severely he was left near death. In 2017, Yazid had been arrested for aggravated battery on a police officer. In 2012, he had allegedly tried to kill 2 officers by ramming his car into theirs. And in June of 2020, while he was already in custody awaiting trial for Aniah's murder, he was charged with the 2018 killing of a man named Stephen Hamby and the attempted murder of a woman who was shot in the face during that same incident. This was the man who had been walking free in October 2019, free on bond, free to go to a gas station in Auburn on a Wednesday night and see a young woman alone. Investigators said there was no evidence Yazid and Aniah knew each other before that night. He had simply seen her at the gas station. He had targeted her, and he had forced her into her own car and driven away. The system that had set his bond, the system that had looked at his record of violence and determined he was safe to release while awaiting trial, had made a decision that cost Aniah Blanchard her life. Her family was determined that decision would never be made the same way again. In the aftermath of Aniah's murder, her family did not only grieve, they fought. Angela Harris and Walt Harris took their grief to the Alabama state legislature. They advocated loudly and consistently for a change in the law, a constitutional amendment that would give judges the authority to deny bond to defendants accused of certain violent crimes. Under the old system, Yazid had been entitled to bond despite his violent history. Angela and Walt argued that no family should have to pay the price for that system again. Alabama voters listened. In November 2020, Alabamans approved a constitutional amendment known as Aniah's Law. It empowers judges to deny bond outright to defendants accused of violent crimes, kidnapping, attempted murder, sexual assault, and other specified offenses. It was a direct and explicit response to the bond conditions that had put Ibrahim Yazid back on the streets after his January 2019 crimes. It was the kind of legislation that carries a name because someone died so that others might live. She was 19 years old, and the law that bears her name is now part of the Alabama Constitution. Aniah's Law passed in 2020. Yazid's trial did not begin until 2026. Between those 2 events lay years of legal delays, pre-trial hearings, continuances, pandemic-related postponements, the grinding machinery of a capital murder case moving slowly through the courts. For 6.5 years, Aniah's family watched. Aniah's family waited. The trial of Ibrahim Yazid finally began on March 9, 2026, at the Macon County Courthouse in the city of Tuskegee, held in Macon County because that was where Aniah's remains had been found, and therefore where the most serious charges were most properly tried. The jury panel was selected from a pool of more than 100 individuals. Over 6 days of testimony prosecutors called 32 witnesses. They presented the surveillance footage from the Chevron gas station showing Yazid and Aniah inside the store at the same time on the night of October 23, 2019. They presented the testimony of the eyewitness who had seen Yazid force Aniah into her vehicle in the parking lot. They presented the evidence from Aniah's car, the blood, the shell casing, the signs of a hasty cleanup, all confirmed to be connected to Aniah by forensic testing. They presented cell phone records and digital tracking data that placed Yazid's movements in the relevant locations on the relevant dates. They called the lead investigator from the Auburn Police Department who walked the jury through the entire timeline. The missing person report, the search along South College Street, the recovery of the car, the search for the suspect, and the eventual discovery of the remains. Aniah Blanchard, Aniah's mother, the person she had dropped off just before she stopped at the gas station, testified for the prosecution. And they called the chief medical examiner, Dr. Edward Reedy, who testified about the recovery of the remains. He described the site behind the church on County Road 2. He described the condition of what was found, scattered, fragmented, skeletonized. He described making a positive identification using dental x-rays. And he described his conclusion, homicide, caused by a gunshot wound to the head, with a projectile recovered from the dirt near her body. The defense challenged the forensic evidence extensively. DNA analysts testified that while Aniah's DNA was found on multiple items of evidence collected from her car, no DNA definitively matching Yazid was found on those same items. No fingerprints matching Yazid were found inside the vehicle either. The defense argued the state had built its case on surveillance footage, witness testimony, and circumstantial evidence, that direct physical evidence linking Yazid to the inside of Aniah's car was absent. The defense also questioned the reliability of certain witnesses, noting that Antoine Fisher, the man who had information about where Aniah's body was taken, had admitted to being under the influence of drugs during the relevant events. When the defense finished its cross-examinations, it rested without calling a single witness of its own. Deliberations began on the morning of Wednesday, March 18, 2026. The jury deliberated for approximately 7 hours across a day and a half. On the morning of March 19, 2026, they returned their verdict. On the count of a capital murder during a kidnapping, guilty of the lesser included offense of felony murder. On the count of capital murder during a robbery, guilty of the lesser included offense of murder. The jury had declined to convict on the capital murder charges themselves, charges that would have opened the door to the death penalty. Instead, they found Yazid guilty of the next tier down. It was not the outcome prosecutors had sought. They had spent the entire trial pursuing a capital conviction. The Alabama Attorney General's office said plainly after the verdict that while they were disappointed the outcome would not allow for the death penalty, they intended to seek the maximum sentence allowed by law. In the courtroom, both families showed visible emotion as the verdict was read. Yazid himself showed some reaction as the words were spoken. Aniah's mother Angela and her stepfather Walt Harris were seen walking out of the courthouse together, holding hands. Aniah's family declined to speak to reporters immediately after the verdict. The defense announced plans to appeal. Defense attorney William Watley maintained that Yazid had been made a scapegoat by elected politicians and convicted on false evidence. The narrative, he said, was not what the evidence showed. 6.5 years, 32 witnesses, a day and a half of deliberations, and a verdict that gave the family something, but not everything they had hoped for. On May 7, 2026, Ibrahim Yazid appeared before Judge Tom Young at the Macon County Courthouse for sentencing. Judge Young sentenced Yazid to life in prison on both counts, one for felony murder, one for murder. He deliberately imposed 2 sentences with the intention of allowing the appellate court to determine which conviction to set aside in order to prevent a double jeopardy issue, since both convictions arose from the same underlying act. The maximum allowable sentence had been imposed. Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall issued a statement following the sentencing. "Today, justice has been served," he said. "I am gratified that the court imposed the maximum allowable sentence for the senseless and brutal murder of Aniah Blanchard, life in prison. It is the sentence that the weight of this crime demanded, and one that Aniah's family has long deserved." One important detail the defense noted after sentencing: because Yazid was not convicted of capital murder, his life sentence does include the technical possibility of parole. When or whether he might ever become eligible for parole will depend on the structure of the sentence as it works through the appellate process. He has 42 days from the verdict to file his appeal. His attorneys have confirmed they intend to do so. The murder of Aniah Blanchard changed Alabama law. Aniah's law, the constitutional amendment her family fought for, passed by Alabama voters in November 2020, now gives judges the explicit authority to deny bond to defendants accused of specified violent crimes. It was a direct response to the bail system that had allowed Ibrahim Yazid to walk free despite his violent history, free to go to a gas station in Auburn on a Wednesday night and target a 19-year-old girl. The law that bears her name exists because her family refused to let her death be only a tragedy. They insisted it also be a change. More than 40 law enforcement agencies participated in the investigation and prosecution of this case, including the Auburn Police Department, the Montgomery Police Department, the FBI, the Macon County Sheriff's Office, the Lee County Sheriff's Office, the Tuskegee Police Department, and the Alabama Attorney General's Office. The Attorney General himself was personally involved in the prosecution. None of it brought Aniah back. But a man who targeted her, kidnapped her, and killed her is now serving 2 life sentences in an Alabama prison, and a law with her name on it is now part of the Alabama Constitution, designed to make sure the conditions that put him on that street that night, free on bond, facing kidnapping and attempted murder charges, cannot happen the same way to another family. She was afraid of being kidnapped her whole life, and the law that now prevents what happened to her carries her name. That is not justice, but it is something. Aniah Haley Blanchard was born on June 22, 2000, the same birthday as her mother Angela. She was 19 years old. She was a student. She had a dog she loved and a brother she talked to every morning, and a stepfather who called her his own child, and a mother who shared a birthday with her. She was afraid of being kidnapped. She had said so. The people who loved her knew it. On the night of October 23, 2019, she stopped at a gas station on her way home, minutes away from her apartment, minutes away from her roommate who was waiting for her. She texted that she was almost there. She never made it through the door. Story 2. May 2nd, 2001, Chevy Chase, Maryland. It was a Wednesday. The kind of spring morning that makes the Washington, D.C. suburbs feel like the quietest, safest place in the world. Tree-lined streets, manicured yards, neighbors who knew each other by name. The kind of neighborhood where nothing bad was supposed to happen. Leslie Prier did not show up for work that morning. For the people who knew her, that alone was enough. Leslie Prier was not the kind of person who simply didn't show up. She worked as an advertising production worker and was reliable, present, consistent. When she wasn't at her desk and wasn't answering her phone, her employer didn't wait long before reaching out to her family. Her husband, Carl Prier, known to everyone as Sandy, and her employer went to the house together. The address was on Drummond Avenue in Chevy Chase, a quiet street in an affluent suburb just north of the District of Columbia. When they got inside, they found a scene that had nothing to do with the quiet street or the perfect spring morning. Blood on the walls, blood on the floor, furniture overturned, the house in disarray in a way that spoke of violence, sudden, terrible, and personal. Montgomery County Police were called. Officers conducted a welfare check and found Leslie Ann Prier inside her home. Her body was discovered lying face down, partially inside an upstairs shower. The medical examiner determined she had been killed by a combination of blunt force trauma to the head and strangulation. She had bruising on her arms, her legs, her torso. The evidence told investigators she had fought back hard. Leslie Prier was 48 years old. Blood under her fingernails, she fought whoever did this, and what she left behind in that fight would sit in an evidence freezer for 23 years, waiting for the science to catch up. Leslie Ann Jennings was born on October 5, 1952, in Rhode Island, the daughter of William and Miriam Jennings, and one of 8 siblings. She grew up in a large, close family, graduated from Pensacola High School, and went on to earn a degree from the University of Florida in 1973. On October 26, 1974, she married Carl Eugene Prier III, Sandy. They built a life together in the Washington, D.C. area, eventually settling in Chevy Chase, Maryland, one of the most desirable suburbs in the region. They had a daughter named Lauren. By 2001, Leslie was deeply woven into the fabric of the community. She worked in advertising production. She volunteered at a local library, teaching English as a second language to non-native speakers. She was one of 8 siblings, with a large extended family that loved her fiercely. She was, by every account, a woman who put herself into the lives of the people around her, at work, in the community, and especially at home. Her daughter, Lauren, has described their relationship as exceptionally close. The kind of mother-daughter bond where the absence of one person leaves a hole the other can never fully close. On the morning of May 2, 2001, that hole opened. Montgomery County homicide detectives took the case immediately. The evidence from the crime scene was processed carefully. Male DNA was found in multiple locations, including critically beneath Leslie Prier's fingernails. She had scratched her attacker. She had fought him and left a mark. The DNA belonged to an unknown male. In homicide investigations, detectives start with the people closest to the victim. In the case of a married woman killed in her own home, the first person investigators look at is the husband. Sandy Prier was interviewed, and the early signs were not good for him. Neighbors had noticed something unusual the night before Leslie was found. One neighbor told detectives that he had looked toward the Prier house that evening and noticed that every light in the house was on, but all the drapes were closed. He said he felt it was unusual, not alarming enough to call anyone, but unusual. Sandy was brought in for a formal interview, which was recorded on tape. In that interview, he acknowledged that his marriage had been under strain. He described Leslie in conflicted terms, called her an absolute love, beauty, before adding that she would drink heavily at times, and that on some evenings he had come home late to avoid the tension her drinking created. He also failed a polygraph test. Investigators looked hard at Sandy Prier. They had behavioral indicators. They had inconsistencies. They had motive, at least in theory. What they did not have was a DNA match. The male DNA found beneath Leslie's fingernails and at the crime scene did not belong to Sandy Prier. When the initial 2001 analysis came back, it excluded him and excluded every other man in Leslie's known circle who was tested. He failed the polygraph, he acknowledged the marriage was strained, and then his DNA didn't match, and the case had nowhere left to go. The investigation stalled without a DNA match to any known suspect. Detectives had no viable path forward. The case went cold. Sandy Prier lived under the shadow of unspoken suspicion for the rest of his life. He died in 2017, 16 years after his wife was murdered, never knowing who had killed her, never having the shadow lifted. Lauren Prier spent those same 16 years without her mother and with the weight of watching her father carry something he could never put down. 9 months after Leslie Prier's murder, in February of 2002, a neighbor came forward with a tip. The neighbor told investigators that Lauren Prier had a boyfriend during her teenage years, a young man who lived in the neighborhood, who had been close to the family, who had come around the house. His name was Eugene Gligor. Investigators noted the tip. They logged it in the case file, but in 2002, with no DNA match on file for Gligor and no other evidence connecting him to the crime, the tip led nowhere. The name went into the file stayed cold. Years passed. The case was reviewed periodically. It was never closed. Active homicide cases in Montgomery County don't close without resolution. But it went quiet. The original detectives moved on. New investigators inherited the file. It sat. And Lauren Prier, who had grown up down the street from Eugene Gligor, who had dated him when they were both 15 years old, who had watched him come to the family dinners and holiday gatherings and game nights in her home, never suspected him, not once in 23 years. She described him later as someone who would never have imagined. Someone she would never have imagined. Someone who had seemed ordinary, unremarkable, someone her family had welcomed in. His name was in the file the whole time, put there by a neighbor 9 months after the murder, and for 23 years it just sat there, waiting. To understand how Eugene Gligor ended up in the Prier home on the morning of May 2nd, 2001, you have to go back to the mid-1990s. Gligor and Lauren Prier had grown up in the same neighborhood in Chevy Chase. They attended high school together. They began dating when they were both approximately 15 years old. It was the kind of teenage relationship that happens in close neighborhoods. Two young people in the same community, thrown together by proximity and adolescence. During the time they dated, Gligor became a familiar presence in the Prier household. He joined the family for dinners. He was there at holidays. He was part of the fabric of their home in the way that a teenager's boyfriend becomes, over time, someone the family knows and accepts. Lauren and Gligor eventually stopped dating, as teenage relationships usually do. They went their separate ways. Their lives diverged. Gligor moved to Washington, D.C. The connection to the Prier family faded. By May of 2001, the relationship had been over for years. But Gligor knew the house. He knew the neighborhood. He knew the family's routines in the way that someone who had spent time there would know them. At sentencing, he would claim that the murder occurred after a night of heavy drinking and cocaine use, that he had no clear memory of his intent, that he could not explain why he had gone to that house on that morning or what had led to what happened inside it. He did not claim innocence. He admitted he killed Leslie Prier. He simply claimed he could not fully account for why. In the fall of 2022, Montgomery County detectives Tara Augustin and Allison Dupuy were assigned to the Leslie Prier cold case. The two detectives were part of the Montgomery County Police Department's cold case unit, a team tasked with reopening old files and applying new technology to evidence that had been collected before the science existed to use it properly. Their approach to cold cases was methodical and personal. When they took a case, they made a point of connecting with the surviving family members. They believed that staying in contact with the people most affected by the case was part of doing the work properly. They reached out to Lauren Prier. Over the 2 years that followed, as they worked the case, they stayed in regular contact with her. Lauren's relationship with her mother had been the central fact of her life, and the 23 years without answers had taken their toll in ways both visible and invisible. The detectives began by reviewing everything in the file, every interview, every piece of evidence, every tip that had ever come in, including the one filed in February 2002, noting the name of Lauren's former boyfriend. They noted the name. They filed it away. Then they focused on the DNA. In September 2022, investigators submitted the biological evidence from Leslie Prier's crime scene, including the DNA recovered from beneath her fingernails, to a forensic laboratory in Texas called Othram. Othram specialized in a technique that went beyond traditional DNA matching. Using advanced technology, the lab was able to develop a more complete genetic profile from the partial evidence recovered at the scene, a profile detailed enough to be used for forensic genetic genealogy. That profile was submitted to Family Tree DNA, a consumer genealogy company that, with the consent of its users, allows authorized law enforcement agencies to compare crime scene DNA profiles against the genetic data of the company's customers. The search returned a result, not a direct match to a named subject, something more subtle, a partial match, the kind that indicates a biological relationship rather than a direct identification. The match connected the unknown male DNA from Leslie Prier's fingernails to a family line with Romanian origins. 23 years, and then a genealogy website built by people uploading their ancestry out of curiosity, the same technology people used to find distant cousins reached back into a crime scene from 2001 and found a thread. From the partial match to the Romanian family line, detectives Augustine and Dupuy began building a family tree. This is the painstaking work at the heart of forensic genetic genealogy. Investigators don't get a name immediately. What they get is a biological connection, a relative, sometimes distant, sometimes very distant, who shares enough genetic material with the unknown profile to indicate a family relationship. From there, detectives build outward. They research the family, they trace branches, they identify who in that family might have been in the relevant area at the relevant time. Detectives determine that the unknown male from the crime scene was a first cousin twice removed from a genetic genealogy match with Romanian family roots. They worked through the family tree, branch by branch, until they had a list of American relatives connected to that Romanian line. And then Detective Augustine searched publicly available records and news articles about the matching family. She named the surname Gligor. She recognized it immediately, not because she had memorized the entire 23-year-old case file, but because the name Gligor was memorable, distinctive enough to have stuck in her mind from her review of the original reports. She went back to the file. There it was, the 2002 tip. The neighbor's name, Eugene Gligor, Lauren Prier's ex-boyfriend from high school, the young man who would come to family dinners and holiday gatherings in the house at Drummond Avenue. His name had been in the file for 22 years, and his DNA had never been in any law enforcement database. Not CODIS, not any state criminal database, because Eugene Gligor had never been convicted of a crime that required DNA connection. He had slipped through unknown, unmatched, undetected for more than 2 decades. Now detectives knew who they were looking for. What they needed was proof. Investigators placed Eugene Gligor under surveillance. He was living in Washington, D.C., not far from where he had grown up. He was going about his daily life, unaware, apparently, that detectives were watching, unaware that a family tree built from a genealogy database had led investigators directly to his door. On June 9, 2024, surveillance teams followed Gligor to Dulles International Airport. He was going through customs and secondary screening. He had a plastic water bottle with him. Investigators watched him drink from it. They watched him set it down. They watched him discard it. The moment he had walked away, officers moved in. They retrieved the bottle from where Gligor had thrown it. They swabbed it for DNA, the residue left behind by a man who had no idea anyone was watching. No idea that the water bottle he had just tossed in an airport trash bin was about to become the most important piece of evidence in a 23-year-old murder case. Within a week, laboratory results came back. The DNA from the water bottle matched the DNA recovered from beneath Leslie Prier's fingernails. It matched the DNA found at the crime scene. The same man, without question. The profile from 2001 and the profile from the airport trash bin were the same. An arrest warrant was obtained on Saturday, June 15, 2024. On Tuesday, June 18, 2024, a sunny morning, 80 degrees, Eugene Gligor was sitting on the steps outside his apartment building in Washington, D.C. He was scrolling through his phone. He was drinking a cup of coffee. A voice came toward him, rising in volume. "Hands up." The U.S. Marshals Task Force took him into custody. When confronted with the evidence, Gligor broke down and cried. He had been sitting on the steps of his apartment building, drinking coffee in the sun. For 23 years he had woken up every morning as a free man, and then one Tuesday in June, it ended on the front steps. Lauren Prior learned that her mother's killer had been arrested. She learned that the arrest had been made possible by DNA evidence, and that the DNA had led investigators to a name she recognized, a name from her own past, a young man she had dated as a teenager, someone who had sat at her family's dinner table, someone she had never, not for a single moment in 23 years, suspected. She described the news as unreal. In a statement after the arrest, Montgomery County State's Attorney John McCarthy, who had also prosecuted the Sarah Harris case involving Dr. James Ryan, addressed what the technology had accomplished. "Science doesn't lie," he said. "Technology doesn't lie." But the arrest also carried a particular weight for Lauren that the technology and the science could not fully address. Her father, Sandy, the man who had spent years under unspoken suspicion, who had failed a polygraph, who had died in 2017, still living in the shadow of his wife's unsolved murder, would never know that his name had been cleared in the most complete way possible. Not just cleared because the DNA didn't match him, cleared because the actual killer had been identified, arrested, and would eventually confess. Sandy Prior died not knowing. Lauren had to carry that too. Eugene Gligor was initially charged with first-degree murder. He had been held at the D.C. jail pending extradition to Maryland and had been remanded without bond. Negotiations with prosecutors led to a plea agreement. On May 8, 2025, just days after the 24th anniversary of Leslie Prior's murder, Gligor appeared in a Montgomery County courtroom and pleaded guilty to one count of second-degree murder. He said little during the plea hearing itself. His defense attorney, Isabel Raquin, would later describe Gligor as a man who endured a childhood marked by trauma and substance abuse. She argued at sentencing that his struggles with mental health, alcohol, and drugs were relevant context for what had happened on that spring morning in 2001, that the murder had occurred after a night of heavy drinking and cocaine use, that there had been no premeditation, no clear motive. Prosecutors Donna Fenton and Jody Mount had a different view. They had asked for the maximum sentence of 30 years, the maximum allowable under Maryland law for the offense as it existed in 2001. They described the day of sentencing plainly. Today is a day of reckoning. The sentencing guidelines for second-degree murder in Maryland ran from 10 to 18 years. Prosecutors were asking for nearly double the top of that range. The defense asked for 10 years. On August 28, 2025, Eugene Gligor appeared in the Montgomery County Circuit Court in Rockville for sentencing. More than 60 people filled the courtroom, family members, friends, people who had known and loved Leslie Prior for decades, people who had grown up in the same Chevy Chase neighborhood where she had lived and died. Gligor was given the opportunity to address the court. He spoke for approximately 10 minutes. He apologized to the Prior family multiple times. He expressed what he described as profound remorse. Leslie's oldest brother, Bill Jennings, did not find the words convincing. Gligor could have still been talking, he said afterward, and it wouldn't have done anything for me. I thought his words were empty and impossible to believe. Judge David Lease listened to both sides. He took into account Gligor's history of mental health struggles and substance abuse. He acknowledged that the sentencing guidelines suggested a shorter term, and then he imposed a sentence above those guidelines, 30 years in prison, with all but 22 years suspended. 5 years of supervised probation upon release. Gligor was also ordered to seek a mental health evaluation and treatment, and to have no contact with the Prier family. When the sentence was announced, cheers broke out in the courtroom. Someone called out, "Thank you." The 60-plus people who had come that morning let themselves feel something they had been waiting 24 years to feel. 60 people in a courtroom cheering for a 22-year sentence. That's what 24 years of waiting for justice looks like when it finally arrives. The conviction of Eugene Gligor was not only the resolution of a cold case, it was a milestone. Montgomery County State's Attorney John McCarthy noted that this case marked the first conviction in Montgomery County, Maryland, resulting from the use of familial DNA, forensic genetic genealogy used not to directly identify a suspect, but to build a family tree from partial evidence and work backward to a name. The technique has become increasingly important in cold case investigations across the country. In the years since it was first used in high-profile cases, it has led to the identification of suspects in murders, sexual assaults, and other violent crimes that went unsolved for decades. Leslie Prier's case is now part of that record, a demonstration of what the technology can do when the original investigators preserve the evidence carefully enough for future science to use. In 2022, when the case was reopened, Montgomery County Police had also offered a $10,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. It was a sign that investigators had not given up, that the case file was still being worked, still being reviewed, still being taken seriously by people who believed that Leslie Prier's family deserved an answer. They got one. The detectives who got it, Tara Augustin and Allison Dupuy, built the case from a partial genealogy match to an airport trash bin over the course of 2 years. They stayed in contact with Lauren Prier throughout. They understood that cold cases are not just about evidence. They are about the people who have been living with the absence. Doing this job, I want to help people, Augustin said after the arrest. When you're in the cold case unit, you get to reconnect with the family. Leslie Ann Jennings Prier was born in Rhode Island in 1952. She was one of 8 children. She graduated from the University of Florida. She married a man who called her an absolute love. She had a daughter she adored. She volunteered to teach English to people who needed to learn it. She was present. She was connected. She was, by every account, exactly the kind of person a community holds on to. On the morning of May 2nd, 2001, she fought back against whoever came into her home. The DNA she left beneath her fingernails in the final moments of her life was preserved for 23 years through changes in technology, changes in personnel, changes in the tools available to investigators, and it was ultimately that evidence collected in a moment of desperate resistance that identified the man who killed her. Her daughter, Lauren, grew up without her. Her husband, Sandy, lived and died without knowing who had taken her from him. Eugene Gligor is serving 22 years in a Maryland prison. The name in the file from 2002 finally has a face behind bars. Leslie Ann Prier, October 5th, 1952 to May 2nd, 2001. Story 3. It was the early morning hours of March 4th, 2022, in the small mountain town of Camas, Utah, a quiet community nestled in the Camas Valley just east of the ski resort town of Park City, in the shadow of the Uinta Mountains, the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where families go to raise children away from the noise of the city. At 3:21 in the morning, a 911 call came in from a home just outside of town. A woman named Corey Richins told the dispatcher her husband was unresponsive. She said she had gone to sleep in their son's room earlier in the night because the child was having nightmares. When she returned to the master bedroom around 3 in the morning, she reached over to put her arm around Eric, and he was cold to the touch. Like putting your arm over a cement brick, she would later tell investigators. First responders arrived. Eric Richins, 39 years old, was pronounced dead in the bedroom he shared with his wife. Investigators from the Summit County Sheriff's Office began examining the circumstances. Eric had no known history of drug use. He was healthy, active, by every account a man in the prime of his life. Toxicology results came back weeks earlier. Eric Richins had died of fentanyl intoxication. The level of fentanyl in his blood was 15 nanograms per milliliter, approximately 5 times the lethal dosage. The medical examiner confirmed it was illicit fentanyl, not medical grade. It had been orally ingested. Eric Richins had not taken this drug himself. 5 times the lethal dose, orally ingested, and a man who had never used drugs in his life. The toxicology report answered one question and opened 100 more. Eric Eugene Richins was born on May 13, 1982 in Utah. The oldest of 3 children, raised by his parents Linda and Gene Richins. He grew up on a cattle ranch, mending fences, hauling hay, learning the rhythms of hard physical work in the Utah mountains. He was blue-eyed, athletic, and naturally competitive. He played basketball, baseball, and soccer growing up. He hunted and fished. He coached his son's sports teams. He was the kind of man people described almost universally in the same terms, the sweetest guy. Genuinely kind, fiercely loyal, the sort of person who showed up without being asked. He co-owned a stone masonry company called C&E Stone Masonry with his business partner and close friend, Cody Wright. The 2 men had built it together from the ground up. The business was successful and well regarded. They had a buy-sell life insurance agreement between them, a standard arrangement ensuring that if one partner died, the other could buy out his share and keep the business going. Each man was the other's beneficiary on that policy. He met Corey Darden in 2009 when she was working as a cashier at a local Home Depot. A mutual friend made the introduction. Eric was taken with her. They dated for several years. On June 15, 2013, they married in Utah. On their wedding day, at the insistence of Eric's family, they signed a prenuptial agreement. That prenuptial agreement would become the engine of everything that followed. The prenuptial agreement contained specific provisions about Eric's assets. In the event of a divorce, several of those assets would remain solely in Eric's possession. His 50% ownership stake in C&E Stone Masonry, his equipment, his vehicles, his business interests. If they divorced, Corey walked away with very little of what he had built. But there was one clause that worked the other way. If Eric died while they were still married, those assets would pass to Corey. the business interest worth approximately $2 million, the life insurance proceeds, his stake in everything they had accumulated. Divorce meant walking away with almost nothing. Death meant millions. One clause and a document signed on their wedding day. Eric, at some point, had grown uneasy enough about this to take additional steps. He established the Eric Richins Living Trust and transferred his business interest into it, naming his sister as the trustee, not Corey. He updated his will. He did what he could to ensure that if something happened to him, his children and his family would be protected. He had quietly been protecting himself for some time. What he apparently did not anticipate was that those protections might not come soon enough. The couple had 3 sons, all boys, the oldest around 10 years old at the time of Eric's death. From the outside, the Richins family looked like exactly what their mountain community admired. A hard-working couple, a beautiful home, a successful business, 3 healthy children, the picture of stability and success. The inside was a different story entirely. Corey Richins ran her own real estate company, K. Richins Realty, buying and flipping houses. Between 2019 and 2022, the business expanded aggressively. It also failed in ways that were not immediately visible to the people around her. Forensic accountant Brooke Carrington testified at trial that she had reviewed hundreds of thousands of documents, property deeds, loan records, emails, bank statements, the couple's premarital agreement. She had interviewed accountants, realtors, and insurance providers. What she had found was a financial enterprise in collapse. By the time of Eric's death in March 2022, Corey had accumulated approximately $7.5 million in debt. The forensic accountant testified plainly that selling everything Corey owned would not have gotten her back to zero. She was not struggling. She was underwater in a way that had no conventional exit. The problems had been building for years. In 2019, Corey had borrowed $250,000 using Eric's power of attorney, without his direct permission or knowledge. Eric's family said he was never told. Corey claims she repaid it. His sister disputed that. She had also, beginning in 2015, taken out 4 separate life insurance policies on Eric without his knowledge. Policies totaling approximately $1.9 million. And then there was the business policy. Eric and Cody Wright, his business partner, had a $2 million buy-sell life insurance agreement between them. In January of 2022, 2 months before Eric's death, Corey logged into the account for that policy using Eric's credentials and changed the beneficiary from Cody Wright to herself. The insurance company noticed and notified Eric. He changed it back. Prosecutors argued that Corey may not have known Eric had reinstated his business partner, that when she poured that drink on the night of March 3rd, she may have believed she was still the beneficiary of a $2 million policy on his life. He changed it back, and it was possible she never knew. Possible that when she made him that Moscow mule, she thought the policy was still hers. Eric's total estate at the time of his death was valued by prosecutors at approximately $5 million. Under the prenup's death clause, the one his family had insisted he included on the day they married, it would all have passed to Corey, and she needed it desperately because with $7.5 million in debt, and a real estate business that could not be saved, there was no conventional way out. By the end of 2021 and into early 2022, people close to Eric Richins were noticing something. He seemed unsettled, wary, like a man who began to sense something was wrong but couldn't yet name what it was. His business partner, Cody Wright, testified about a phone call he received from Eric on February 14, 2022, Valentine's Day. Wright described urgency and fear in Eric's voice unlike anything he had heard from his friend before. Eric told him he felt like he was dying after eating a sandwich Corey had prepared for him. A hunting and camping friend named Josh Kays also received a call from Eric after the Valentine's Day incident. Kays testified that Eric was somber and sincere in a way completely out of character for the two men who usually bantered and joked. Eric spoke with a gravity that Kays said he had never encountered in their friendship. Eric's sister Amy had gone further. She testified at sentencing that she had begged her brother to leave Corey. She had seen enough, the financial tension, the state of the marriage, things she could not fully articulate but deeply felt. She had told him directly to get out. Eric refused. His reason was his boys. He was determined to stay present in their lives. He believed that staying, being their father every single day, being there to watch over them, was more important than his own fear. He would not leave his children. He had also taken practical steps: the trust, the updated will, the quiet restructuring of his assets in ways designed to protect his family if something happened to him. He could not prove what he suspected, but he had begun to act on it. He stayed to protect his boys, and it cost him his life. While all of this was unfolding, the mounting debt, the failing business, the growing tension in the marriage, Corey Richins had been having an affair. The man was Robert Josh Grossman. He had originally met Corey years earlier when she was flipping a house in South Carolina. In 2020, he moved from South Carolina to Utah, and their relationship became romantic. He lived in properties she was renovating while he worked on them. A business arrangement layered over a personal one. He testified at trial. He confirmed the affair. He said he felt guilt and sorrow sitting in that courtroom. He said the relationship ended a few months after Eric's death, but the text messages between Corey and Grossman, shown to the jury during opening statements, told the story of where her mind had been in the weeks before March 4th. Weeks before Eric died, she wrote to Grossman, "If he could just go away and you could just be there, life would be so perfect." The day before Eric died, the day before she made him that Moscow mule, she texted Grossman, "If I was divorced right now and asked you to marry me tomorrow, would you?" He said yes. 16 days after Eric's death, while she was supposed to be a grieving widow, she sent Grossman a link to a Caribbean resort. She wrote, "Are we there yet?" About a month after Eric died, she texted, "I think I want you to be my husband one day." Prosecutors also pointed to a conversation Corey had at a Christmas party in December 2021, just weeks before Eric's death, with an employee of C&E Stonemasonry, Eric's own company. The employee testified that Corey pulled her aside, told her she felt trapped in her marriage, and then said something that the employee described as memorable. She said it would be better if Eric were dead. 16 days after her husband died, a Caribbean resort, are we there yet? Prosecutors argued that March 4th was not Corey's first attempt on Eric's life. On February 14, 2022, Eric became violently ill after eating a sandwich Corey had prepared for him. He called Cody Wright with fear in his voice. He called Josh Kays, sounding unlike himself. He told them he felt like he was dying. He survived that day. The defense would argue at trial that this was an allergic reaction. There was no direct evidence anything had been put in the sandwich. Prosecutors argued it was a first poisoning attempt, using fentanyl that Corey had already begun acquiring through her housekeeper in early 2022. 3 weeks later, on the evening of March 3rd, Corey brought Eric a Moscow Mule cocktail to their bedroom. She said they were celebrating a successful real estate transaction, a house she had just closed on. He drank it in bed. He also consumed a THC gummy that evening. Corey told investigators she then went and put one of their sons to bed because the child was having nightmares. She said she fell asleep in the child's room. She said she returned to the master bedroom around 3 in the morning, reached for Eric and found him cold. Cell phone records showed Corey first accessed her phone at 3:06 a.m. She did not call 911 until 3:21 a.m. 15 minutes had passed between the moment she first picked up her phone and the moment she called for help. What she was doing on a phone in those 15 minutes was never fully explained at trial. Carmen Lauber worked as a housekeeper for the Richins family. She became the prosecution's most critical witness. Lauber testified that Corey had contacted her multiple times in early 2022 asking her to obtain drugs. On the first contact, Corey told her she needed pain pills for an investor she knew. Lauber obtained opiate pills through a dealer. Then Corey came back and asked for something stronger. Lauber reached out to a man named Robert Crozier, who had pills containing fentanyl. When she texted Corey about the option, Corey replied simply, "Okay, go ahead and get them." Over the weeks that followed, Lauber acquired up to 90 blue-green fentanyl pills for Corey across multiple transactions. The medical examiner had confirmed the fentanyl in Eric's system was illicit, not pharmaceutical grade, consistent with exactly the kind of pills Lauber described. Then came the phone call after Eric died. Lauber said she called Corey directly and asked her one question: "Please tell me these pills were not for him." Corey's response was immediate: "No, they were not. Eric passed away from a brain aneurysm." Eric Richins had not died from a brain aneurysm. He had died of a massive fentanyl overdose, and Corey had just lied directly and specifically to the woman who had sold her the fentanyl that killed him. He passed away from a brain aneurysm, said to the woman who had provided the fentanyl, the woman who would later take an oath and tell a jury everything. Prosecutors presented Corey's internet search history to the jury at trial. The searchers formed a timeline of their own. Before Eric died, if someone is poisoned, what does it go down on the death certificate as? What is a lethal dose of fentanyl? Can cops force you to do a lie detector test? These were the searches of a woman either planning something very specific or thinking very carefully about the consequences of what she was already planning. Another search after Eric died. Can cops uncover deleted messages, iPhone? Women Utah prison. Luxury prisons for the rich America. She was researching what prison might look like, preparing somewhere in her calculations for the possibility of being caught, and she was already wondering whether money might make even that outcome more bearable. The defense presented a counter-narrative. Eric had recently traveled to Mexico, they suggested. Perhaps he had obtained fentanyl there. Perhaps the THC gummy he consumed that night had been unknowingly laced. Perhaps his death was a tragic accident that Corey had nothing to do with. There was, defense attorneys argued, reasonable doubt. They called no witnesses. Corey did not take the stand. 1 year after Eric's death, in March of 2023, Corey Richins published a children's picture book. She wrote it with her 3 sons. She titled it, "Are You With Me?" The book followed a young boy who had lost his father. It asked whether a parent who was gone can still be present, in the wind, in the warmth of sunlight, in the small moments of daily life. Corey dedicated the book to her, quote, "amazing husband and a wonderful father." She sold it on Amazon. In April 2023, she appeared on a local Utah lifestyle television program called Good Things Utah to promote it. She spoke about navigating grief with young children. She described Eric's death as unexpected. She said that just because he was not present physically didn't mean his presence was gone. Dad is still here, she said, just in a different way. The interview was warm, composed, and convincing. On May 8, 2023, approximately 1 month after that television appearance, investigators came to her door and placed her under arrest. She was charged with aggravated murder and related offenses. She was taken into custody and would spend nearly 3 years in jail awaiting trial. The children's book, Are You With Me?, was eventually removed from Amazon. She wrote a grief book. She sat on local television and talked about healing. She dedicated it to her amazing husband. 1 month later, they put her in handcuffs. The murder case was not the only legal problem Corey Richins faced. In June of 2025, prosecutors filed 26 additional felony charges against her in a separate case. Charges tied to alleged financial crimes dating back to 2021. 5 counts of mortgage fraud, 7 counts of money laundering, 5 counts of forgery, 7 counts of issuing bad checks, 1 count of communications fraud, and 1 count of engaging in a pattern of unlawful activity under Utah's version of RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. The charges painted a picture of a real estate operation built partially on falsified documents and fraudulent loan applications. Investigators alleged Corey had misrepresented her finances, forged documents, laundered money through her business, and passed bad checks. When applying for mortgage loans, they said she had blamed others for her low credit score, including, in one instance, claiming an unknown person in Seattle had stolen her Social Security number. These charges were filed separately and await their own proceedings. They have not yet gone to trial. But they filled in the financial picture that prosecutors had already drawn at the murder trial. A woman who had built an empire on borrowed money and fraudulent paperwork. A woman who owed $7.5 million and had no legal way out. A woman whose only exit, the only exit that erased the debt, satisfied the prenup's death clause and freed her to start over, was for her husband to die. The murder trial of Corey Richins began in February 2026 at the Summit County Courthouse in Park City. 3 weeks, 13 days of testimony. More than 40 witnesses called by the prosecution. Cody Wright testified about the Valentine's Day phone call, the urgency and fear he heard in Eric's voice. Josh Kays testified about the somber, unlike himself call he received. The C&E Stone Masonry employee testified about the Christmas party conversation where Corey said it would be better if Eric were dead. Carmen Lauber testified about the 90 fentanyl pills and the phone call where Corey told her Eric had died of a brain aneurysm. The jury saw the text messages between Corey and Grossman, the Caribbean resort link, the marriage proposal questions sent the day before Eric died. They heard from Grossman himself, emotional on the stand, describing guilt and sorrow. They heard the forensic accountant describe $7.5 million in debt. They saw the internet searches. They heard the medical examiner describe the concentration of fentanyl in Eric's blood. 15 nanograms per milliliter, 5 times a lethal dose. Lead prosecutor Brad Bloodworth was direct in his closing argument. She did not have the money to leave Eric or the money to salvage her business. Corey Richins is an intensely ambitious person. She is a risk taker. There was a way forward. Eric had to die. She murdered Eric Richins, he told the jury, and then she submitted a claim to get the money. The defense called no witnesses. Corey did not testify. After 3 weeks of evidence, the jury deliberated for just over 3 hours. On March 16, 2026, all 5 counts came back guilty. Aggravated murder, attempted aggravated murder, 2 counts of insurance fraud, forgery. Unanimous on every count. Eric's family embraced in the courtroom. His sister Amy, who had begged him to leave, who had watched him refuse because he was determined to protect his boys, who had sat through every day of that trial, was there when the verdict was read. Sentencing was scheduled for May 13, 2026, Eric Richardson's birthday. He would have turned 44. Eric's family spoke first. His sister Amy told the court the crime didn't happen just once. It happened every morning when those boys woke up and realized their father was still gone. His sister Katie, who now had the 3 boys living with her, told the court that Corey's sons were not props for some twisted children's book about grief, and yet that is what they had been reduced to. Social workers read letters written by the 3 boys themselves. All 3 said they would feel unsafe if their mother was ever released from prison. Then Corey Richins addressed the court. She stood at the podium in a lime green jail uniform and spoke for approximately 30 minutes. She directed her words to her sons, who were not in the courtroom. She told them she knew they were angry with her. She told them she would be there when they were ready. She encouraged them to always be like their dad. She said she loved them and would fight no matter how long it takes. And she maintained one final time that she was innocent, that the verdict against her was an absolute lie, that she had not taken their father from them. Judge Richard Mrazek listened to all of it. He considered what had been proven at trial. A woman who had attempted to poison her husband once, failed, and then tried again 3 weeks later and succeeded. All for financial gain, all to escape a debt she had created and a life she had decided she no longer wanted. He said Corey Richins was simply too dangerous to ever be free. He sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. On the count of attempted aggravated murder, 5 years to life, to run consecutively additional consecutive terms on the fraud and forgery counts. She will appeal. Her attorneys have already said so. She will spend the rest of her life in a Utah prison on what would have been her husband's 44th birthday, and those three boys, the ones she wrote the grief book for, the ones she addressed from a podium in a green jail uniform, will grow up without either of their parents at home. Eric Richins grew up on a cattle ranch in the Utah mountains. He built a business with his own hands. He raised three sons. He coached their sports teams. He hunted and fished and lived a life deeply rooted in the land and the people he came from. He had begun to sense something was wrong in the final months of his life. He had called his friends with fear in his voice. He had taken steps to protect his children. He had refused to leave his sons, even when he should have. He could not have known that the prenuptial agreement signed on his wedding day, the clause his family had insisted upon, the one designed to protect him, would become the reason his wife decided to kill him. On the morning of March 4th, 2022, Eric Richins was found dead in his bedroom. He was 39 years old. His sons told the court they would feel unsafe if their mother was ever released. Their uncle and aunt are raising them now. Eric Eugene Richins, May 13, 1982 to March 4, 2022.